Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're going to continue with our study in John. In fact, we're going to continue in chapter 13. Today, we're going to cover verses 13 through 30, 18 through 30. And they're about the point in the Paschal Supper, the Thursday night supper before Jesus is arrested, where he predicts his betrayal. So as you might have guessed, you might guess, Judas is going to have a big part in this lesson. So let's get right on into it. So this is the third time that Judas's betrayal of Jesus is mentioned in John's gospel. It's very important, but we rarely get time to cover more than just about a sentence or two when it comes up. But I'd like to cover it in much more detail. You're going to see that it's much more sinister than what you might think. Of course, it's sinister. We're talking betrayal, but there are some points to it that we rarely get to see that I think you'll see add to the sinister atmosphere of what's going on. If you could get the whole story with all of its implications, it would hit you right between the eyes. I'm going to try to give you the detail that we normally don't get all at one time so that we can have a more of an in-depth understanding of Judas and where he was operating from. We've already looked at John 13:2 a couple of weeks ago. Let me read it. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. All right. They were at the meal, and the devil had already prompted Judas to betray Jesus. To me, this means that Satan had already planted the seeds of temptation in Judas's mind. The mind is always where the battle of the spirit is fought. Romans 12:2 says that we're transformed by the renewing of our minds. We need to change the way we think if we want to change our behavior. And so that's talking about stuff that's in our mind that needs to be changed. Okay, and that's what Judas is dealing with. I think when he's already been prompted, he's already been tempted, and Judas has planted the seed of temptation there. Judas has not committed the sin of betrayal yet, but we must remember that temptation is not the sin. Temptation always comes with sin, and temptation always comes before sin, and we choose to yield to that temptation or not. Okay, so that's the point where Judas is. He's got the seed of temptation in his mind, and he's mulling it over, thinking about what's going on and what he needs to do, what he might want to do. Matthew 26:4 states that the chief priest and the high priest Caiaphas plotted to have Jesus arrested and to be killed. Let me read it for you so you'll see it. Matthew 26, verse 4. And they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. Okay, they don't have a plan in place. Along comes a man named Judas. Matthew 26:4 states that the chief priest and the high priest had already plotted to have Jesus killed, but they had no plan. They made up their minds to do it, but they did not have a plan. So we're going to look at 22 verse 2. Luke 22 verse 2. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. So they didn't have a plan. All right. But as it turns out, the sad part is that Judas actually volunteered to betray Jesus. They didn't approach him. He volunteered. Look at Matthew 26, verse 14 to 16. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" I don't know if we all knew that or not. So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Okay, they counted out 30 pieces of silver for him, but the other Gospels say that he does not get paid until the job is done. If we look at Mark, I want us to understand this. Mark 14:11 says, "They were delighted to hear this," meaning the offer that Judas had made. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. They promised to give him the money, just like you would pay somebody that was adding a room onto your house. "I'll pay you when you get done. When the work is done, I will pay you." So that's what they did there. They in Mark, they say they promised to do it. In Luke 22:5, it says, they were delighted and agreed to give him money. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a deal has been made. A deal has been made, and the payment will be made at the end. So I want us to notice there in Matthew, it says they counted out the money for him. I think that's more like an escrow account. I hate to use that word. It's like an escrow account. They're setting the money aside. "Judas, we've got the 30 pieces of silver laid out for you. You do your part, and the money is yours." Just like you would do if you hired somebody to do the work. You pay them after the work is done. Okay, so they, I've got a side note here. Yeah, I think this would be good for us to look at. This is a side note that goes along with this. I could not find, let's flip to John 18, verse 15 and 16. I couldn't find where they actually paid Judas for betraying Jesus, for his part in it. There is some text that says that he was very remorseful after the death of Jesus, and he tried to return the money. He just threw it into the temple. But between those verses I read where they promised to give it to him and where he actually threw it back, there's not a record of where he actually got the money. But I think there's a place that in the Bible that could very easily be where he got paid. And it's in John 18, verses 15 to 16. Let's look at that. This is at the time of Peter's first denial. Now listen to these verses and look for these little bits of detail. I'm thinking this is where Judas got paid. "Simon Peter and another disciple, not named, another disciple, were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in." So a lot of people think that was John, but that doesn't sound like John to me. Normally, John refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved, that sort of thing. I think it's very likely that disciple that was with Peter was Judas. They don't really know that it was Judas necessarily that betrayed him. I guess that's the only reason Peter would still be having something to do with him. But it says that the disciple was known to the high priest, and he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside. So this disciple that got to go in had more influence. He had some influence because he had been there before. That's what I think. And he goes in, he comes back afterwards and speaks a word to the servant girl on duty and is able to get Peter in. So I think that place right there, John 18 verses 15 and 16, could very easily be where Judas got paid. So up until now, Judas has not committed the sin of betrayal of Jesus. He has sinned in other ways, but not betrayal. We'll see in our study today that Jesus gives him several opportunities to change his mind, but he never does. Okay, I just want to remind you that all of us have been tempted to sin without following through. The temptation is not the sin. It's actually the committing. The action is the sin. My class will tell you that I continually teach that you must decide in advance how you will react when temptation comes your way. You know where your weaknesses lie, even though you don't think that those things will ever come your way. You also know where the misplaced preferences of a sinful world lie. Those may come to you as well. You need to decide in advance how you will react when it comes, or you don't have a chance. My class will also tell you that I teach that God will help you if you only ask when those situations arise. But I also teach God help you if it's your idea. When that sin comes your way, it may be because of your own bidding. You got a real problem when that happens. It was Judas's idea to betray Jesus, and he volunteered to do it. We just read that. There have been several ideas put forth about what could have been Judas's motivations to betray Jesus, but his weaknesses revolved around money. We've seen several things already in our study of John that where Judas would mention money. He was their treasurer. He handled money. So it's not too hard to fathom the temptation that Jesus might encounter would be one that involved money, selfishness, and greed. Before we move on to today's scripture in John, I want to point out a prophecy in Psalm 41, verse 9. I'm calling it a prophecy. It's in 41, verse 9. This points out how sinister the actions surrounding his betrayal really are. Let's look at Psalm 41, verse 9. This has obvious implications and parallels to Judas. You're going to see the word friend. You're going to see trusted. You're going to see shared meal. You're going to see turned against. This next point is probably the hardest for me to tell you about. We have already seen that Judas was sinful and greedy, but if we look at Psalm 41, verse 5 through 8, we also see that Judas's intention are born of malice. That is beyond horrible. When we're talking about a man that was chosen by Jesus, was called by Jesus, he was chosen by Jesus, he walked with Jesus, he was taught by Jesus for 3 years. And here we are going to be seeing support for a situation that was born of malice. Do you know what malice means? It means that you want the worst to happen to someone, even plotting to make it happen. Now let's listen as I read Psalm 41, verses 5 through 8. My enemies say of me in malice, when will he die and his name perish? They say that in malice. When one of them, they actually use the word malice in this translation. When one of them comes to see me, he speaks falsely while his heart gathers slander. Then he goes out and spreads it around. So malice and slander are two big words so far. All of my enemies whisper together against me. They imagine the worst for me, saying, a vile disease has affected him. He will never get up from this place where he lies. They want him to get sick and die. That's what this is talking about. Now we look at verse 9, and if you don't recognize Judas in this, well, we'll slow down and I'll make you understand it. Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me. So that's the last point of this thing I want to talk to you about Judas in this scripture that we're studying today. He is not only selfish and greedy and shown those traits to the world. We're still talking about it today even. But he's also been involved with the enemies who would have to be the high priest and the high priest and what was the other guy? The chief priest. The chief priest and the high priest were the ones that were plotting against him. Back in the very first scripture we read, it said that they were ready to have him arrested and killed. That makes you a pretty good enemy. And Judas played a part in that. That was born of malice. They hated him in every way. And Judas played a part in that. Okay. All right. So let's get on to verse 18. We hadn't even really gotten into verse 18. All right, John 13, verse 18. I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fill this passage of Scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. That was in Psalm 41. As a quote from Psalm 41, verse 9. This is like I said, this is the third time that we've been talking about Judas's betrayal of Jesus. Jesus is really troubled about this matter. I think that's an understatement. The Bible uses the word troubled, but Jesus has been confronted with whether he wants to be obedient or not. In Gethsemane, we've talked about that. But here he's talking about a man that he's called and chosen and called and chosen. And now he knows he's going to betray him, and he is greatly troubled by it. I'll say that Spurgeon supported that use of Psalm 41, verse 9, as a reference to Judas in the Old Testament and the enemies of Jesus. Jesus makes it clear that he chose Judas, but he is also troubled in also knowing what Judas would do and what it means for him. Now, I want to look at Luke 6 on this issue of being called and chosen. Luke 6, verses 12 through 16. Listen as I read. One of those days, Jesus went out onto a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them. So he had a group larger than 12, and he called them to him. And he chose 12 of them, whom he also designated as apostles. So this is the original 12. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. That was a group that Jesus personally called, and he personally chose to be his disciples and be the original 12 apostles. So here in verse 18, Jesus is with his 12 in the upper room. This was at the Paschal Supper, if you'll recall. It goes on for 5 chapters, that upper room event. He knows each very well because he chose each of them, and he has been with them for 3 years in his ministry. Let's look at verse 19. John 13, verse 19. I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I that I am who I am. You will believe that I am who I am. This is like the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel, or any other prophecy for that matter. Nobody really understands it until it's fulfilled. And then we have our aha moment. Now I see it. Okay. They're kind of sitting here saying, well, they'll know it when they see it. So let's look at verse 20. Verse 20 says, very truly I tell you, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. So my boss sends me out on a job with the authority to accomplish certain things. I go with the authority of my boss. The master sends the slave. The slave has the authority of the master. Jesus sends his believers to accomplish certain things, to spread the gospel, to do good works, to do many other things. But we go with the authority of the master giving us that directive. All right. When we go within his will, he sent us. We go with his authority. We work in the master's name to accomplish his purposes. Now I want to talk about a kind of a little side note here about having authority and purpose and power that goes with the master sending us. But let me just make one thing very clear. When he sends you, it's not necessarily when we dream up something that we want to do. Okay. If we are acting within his will, we go with his authority. Look at Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That does not mean anything I dream up, he's going to give me the strength to accomplish. Like there's this big boulder on the golf course. And I'll say, I'm going to pray to God, he's going to give me the power to move that boulder. Probably not going to happen. It was not what Jesus called me to do. If he called me, I've given this example in my class before. I talked to one of the young ladies in there. I said, God might ask you to move 20 chairs by yourself. Not by yourself. He might ask you to move 20 chairs and you're saying, I'm not strong enough to do that. But God asks you to do it, he will provide the power to get it done. So out of nowhere, these two guys walk through the door and say, hey, okay, little lady, we're here to help you. And they just showed up out of nowhere and they moved those chairs. She went with God's will, within God's will, under his direction, and she went with his authority. All right. So I just need us to understand that when I'm talking about going with authority, it's not something we dream up. It's being sent. It's when we are actually sent is what we're talking about here. So if we are sent in his name, we will be accepted in his name. Very important to realize that. All right, verses 21 to 26. We'll look at that verse by verse, I think. But I want to ask you if you know what the word betray means. We've been throwing that thing around here a little bit. You know what that word means? It means to be disloyal to. It means to not be counted on in situation by someone who feels like they should be able to count on you. You undermine certain situations. That's exactly what Judas did. He was in a trustworthy position and he failed to act in a trustworthy manner. All right, let's look at verse 21. John 13, verse 21. After he had said this, it was talking about he who accepts me, accepts the one who sent me. After those words, verse 21, he says, after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. That's red letter. That is rock solid quotation. One of you is going to betray me. And he's talking to the group of 12. And Judas is in that group. They're reclining at the table while they eat their meal. And Jesus is troubled, and he predicts he will be betrayed. Let's look at verse 22. His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. Imagine they're doing more than scratch their head. In all four gospels, he is immediately questions about the identity of the betrayer. Since it was not immediately obvious who the culprit was, it meant that Judas had hidden his true character from them. You know, if they knew what Judas's very character was, his second identity, so to speak, if they knew that other life that he had, they would have known it was him. But he looked just like they looked. They didn't know it was him that Jesus was talking about. Okay, here, so let's go to verse 23 through 25. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." Then verse 25, leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Okay, not a lot to say about that. Here Peter asks across the table to the disciple that Jesus loved, and there's not much question that would be John. And they're reclining. He is reclining next to Jesus to ask him the identity of the one who will betray him. I do not know if only Peter and John could hear the conversation, but nevertheless, Judas was identified. Not by name. Judas probably would not have known that Jesus knew. I mean, this is a big secret that's being kept between the chief priest and Judas. Judas didn't know that anybody else knew. He walks in darkness, and his deeds are in darkness. Can you not imagine that when Jesus gives the bread to him, their eyes are going to meet? And how do you think Judas is going to feel to know, eyeball to eyeball, that Jesus knows that it was him? Jesus brought grace, so even now, it is not too late to forgive, but it will be soon. Jesus responds with the answer in verse 26, but not with a name. He identifies Judas as the betrayer. Let me read that again so we'll know how he did it. Verse 26, he says, Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. He dips it and gave it. Verse 27. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Uh-oh. You know, I've told you so many times up until now, it's not too late. It's not too late. It's not too late. It's still really not too late. But we're walking on the ragged edge right here of being too late when he says that Satan entered into him. That means he had to let Satan come in. He had to invite him in. Satan is not, he has no more power than what we can give him. All right, remember I told you he planted the seed. back in the very beginning at verse 2. He had already he had already prompted Judas, it says, to betray Jesus. He had already prompted him. So he had not entered him. He was there just kind of chatting, talking about what we want you to do, what you could do to further your own gain, Judas. You might want to think about that. So Judas is having to deal with that. When we get to this dinner, he's there knowing that it's going to be pretty soon that he's going to have to make his final decision and actually go through. Even sitting down with the Pharisees, it's not too late. We've all been tempted. We've all walked down that path of temptation on the way to sin and not gone to the end of the path. We changed our mind. We called on God to strengthen us, to do what he promised in 1 Corinthians, to not tempt us beyond what we can bear. Okay, so he is now at the point where it's getting closer and closer to decision time, and here it says that Satan has entered into him. It's ironic that the last thing Jesus shows to Judas is an act of respect in this sharing a meal with him, dipping this bread and giving it to him. That's an act of respect. In fact, he would never eat a meal with somebody he didn't have respect for. But this dipping the bread was just another aspect of it. Okay, so it's ironic that the last thing Jesus does to Judas is an act of respect. And the last thing Judas shows to Jesus is betrayal, and Jesus sends him along his way. And notice he goes out into the night, into the darkness. All right, verse 28. So Jesus told him, "What you're about to do quickly." Satan only prompted Judas in verse 2. He was actually prompted well before that, it said. He had already been prompted, it said. The seed was shown. And here Satan takes complete control. And that is a horrible, horrible thought for Satan to be allowed that power. He entered by the choice of Judas, the choice Judas made to allow it. It is not forced on him. He listened when he was prompted. He actually, he listened. What else can I say? He listened to Satan talk when he was prompted. Now, Satan probably talked to them the same way he talked to us, in ways that we're just kind of find ourselves thinking about things that we never thought we were going to think about. I told you to be thinking, preparing in advance for that temptation when it comes. You know where your weaknesses are, where it might come. Was the money man. He was greedy, and he was selfish. So very likely his problems are going to come around money. And so that temptation came up when he saw a chance to make some money, and he sat down with the chief priest and said, "I can help you out here with this thing you want to do with arresting and killing Jesus." Okay, so he chose, when Satan entered into him, the decision is now made, but it is still not too late to change his mind. I want us to understand that. Until he actually kisses Jesus to identify him, it is not too late. We all know what's going to happen. We've read it hundreds of times. Jesus. Okay, let's look at verse 29. 29 says, "Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor." So there again, he's the church treasurer. Jesus had just said, "What you are about to do quickly." And this verse is just about, the people that heard it. He said, well, sending him out, giving him something to do with that money, go buy something with it, something we need, that sort of thing. Give it to the poor, whatever. Okay, so it brings us to verse 30. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. Nevertheless, when Judas took the bread from Jesus, he went out, and it was night. When it is nighttime, what does it look like outside? It is dark. It is dark, the exact opposite of what Jesus is as light. Judas went into the darkness for good, never to come out. I suppose there could be one more chance to turn back and change his mind because of a hardened heart, meaning, I want that money. I'm not giving it back. I'm going to do whatever I got to do to get paid. Because of a hardened heart, there was no appreciable chance for a change in his mind. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for studying with me.